So for those who don't know, sorry if you hear a bunch of noise coming through my mic. I am sick, and so I'm like struggling to kind of breathe and all that. Anyways, jumping into it, this is a aesthetic and IP talk. So we're gonna go through pretty much figuring out what a style is and how to work in them. So first off, we have to ask the question, what is a style? And pretty much it's a spectrum for your character design, environments, and props. It's usually realism versus cartoon, and studios work all across the board depending on the range of their IPs. So it's important to figure out originally where you want to sit on the spectrum with your art. You don't want to have something be realistic and then have something that's cartoony unless you set that precedent originally, for example, like with Amazing World of Gumball. There are some really stylized examples like Hello Kitty and, of course, Amogus, because, you know, they're both people, which is an interesting difference. And it's important to figure out uh, pretty much what sort of things you want to focus on for your set aesthetic. So that can be you want to stay realistic, but you have more shape-based like armors, or you want to just completely stylize and focus on shape-based like Cult of the Lamb or Hollow Knight, or you can kind of stylize things in terms of rendering. It just depends on what sort of rules you set for yourself when you start out. There is no right answer as long as you're not too all over the board and things are looking coherent, unless, of course, again, your point is to not be coherent. And it's kind of important to realize and feed your visual library because it shows you all the different ways that you can kind of combine elements to push your design one way or another. And it's also important to realize that you do have a propensity to probably specifically stylize certain things, and that's usually based on what you feed your visual library with. So moving on. So it's also important to figure out kind of like who you're wanting to cater to. If this slide looks familiar, is from my last talk. It's important to figure out what audience you want to cater to because you can't cater a realistic game to kids because they're probably not going to pick up on a lot of the things that you'd say want adults to pick up on. These are examples of all kind of really stylized games that are actually more pointed towards young adults. But the important thing to realize is simpler shapes are usually faster reads and clearer reads for kids. Usually you combine them with bright colors because kids like bright colors and it keeps their attention a little bit better compared to something that's super realistic and they probably won't realize that it's not actually real. So it can also be scary to them. Kids don't exactly realize that these things aren't real, so if you're showing a kid a realistic game, they're probably gonna freak out if it's something like The Last of Us. Uh, on the other hand, realism is often reserved for a young adult and up, again, because it's scary to younger audiences, and it has a lot of benefits that come into play because you're able to play with, say, more cinematic styles, you're able to push things more, you're able to dive more into mature themes, whereas, you know, kids' games can't really do that because kids probably will not understand it. It's also important to realize that themes of a game play a really big part as well beyond just character design. Like, for example, Cult of the Lamb is a very cute game, but it's not for kids, even though it has bright colors and very shape based designs. It deals with a cult. You're murdering people. There's blood, there's gore, there's skeletons, and it's probably going to freak a kid out. Um, and as a result, realism often camps in darker areas. So, for example, Ghost of Tsushima and The Last of Us are both probably scary because in Ghost of Tsushima, you're having to deal with kind of, I don't know the era of Tokyo or Japan it takes place in, but it's it's about a lot of honor and ensuring that you're honoring your family and not doing things that aren't socially acceptable unless you want the bad end. On the other hand, Last of Us is definitely not a kid's game because hey, there's like body horror and zombies, and you would probably scar a kid if you saw that. Um, so why is style important? Well, it's a big player in IPs, also known as intellectual properties, and they kind of have like this legal thing where they, you know, kind of set their style and then they look for people who can work in that style. These are the big dogs, so you kind of have to play by their rules because they're looking for a specific set of skills that you can bring to the table in their style. So looking at certain ones. So for example, Riot, League of Legends. It's a dream job for a lot of people. But if you look at it, it's not fully realistic because the bodies are idealized. Uh, the faces are a little bit more realistic, although sometimes they dip a little bit more into like anime-esque. Like if you look at uh, whoop, whoop. If you look at Zeri and uh, Poppy, they're a little bit more stylized and they don't fully follow how a human would look because they're idealized. Um, so they're focused a lot on initial reads and the shapes that are created within a character and how those read on the battlefield. Uh, on the other hand, you have Valorant, which is another Riot IP, and as you can see, it's very, very different from League of Legends because these figures focus more on shape-based. As you can see, they're a little bit more stylized than League's is, and if you look, they also have this kind of signature shading style that breaks down the certain planes of their agents into kind of these blocky rendering shapes, which is what Valorant is mostly known for in their PR. Um, these figures also feel a lot sharper compared to the League of Legends ones. So if you look at the League of Legends ones, they're pretty soft, There's nothing really pointy or, something that's sharp like these Valorant figures. Uh, so they're a little bit more stylized, even though they still kind of share the same body proportions. Um, the rendering is more graphic, again, and then it's important to remember that in order to work in an IP, you often have to work in their style. And depending on, if you continue on with other IPs with that studio, those styles can vary depending on just, what that focus of that game is. So, for example, Bungie is known for having super realistic styles, a little bit more stylized with like D2, and then there's other ones that are super stylized. I don't know the games, but yeah. Uh, so, what is needed to kind of work in an aesthetic or a style? Well, first off, it's very important that you study. And pretty much what you want to study is what makes that style that style. What's the secret sauce they're bringing in? Is it the bright colors? Is it a shape language? Is it their costuming? Is it the sizing of characters? And pretty much figuring out what makes this style stand out compared to other styles. Does it do something specific? What's kind of the aesthetic they're going for? Do they have a certain, you know, aesthetic like retrofuturism they're looking at, or, apocalyptic, stuff like that? It's also important to figure out what choices these artists are making to make this style come and read through. It's also really important to note that even though, styles can be across the board, it's important to make, uh, or sorry, it's important to note that you have to kind of figure out what decisions you want to make because every choice needs to be purposeful and it needs to fit in with the other characters that, the lineup is going to be. You have to kind of figure out what rules you're going to play by and make sure you're kind of sticking within that rule set you set for yourself. That way it looks like it's supposed to. For example, you can't have a stylized or abstract lighting on realistic characters and then, flip it in another scene because that's going to break the player's immersion or, the viewer's immersion. So jumping right in, let's look at some case studies. First up, we have Arcane. I will try and avoid spoilers as much as I can for anyone who hasn't watched it somehow. So, kind of just jumping right in, let's take a look at their props. So, as you can see, these props are very kind of basically lit. There's nothing really, there's not a warm light or a cool light that's like really packing into kind of the asset. All of them fit together, even though they're by multiple different artists. So this left side is by the same artist, and then the right side is by a different artist. And they had a bunch of people working on Arcane, but as you can see, the decisions that they made all come together and work together in this world that was created for Arcane. So if you look at things, for example, on the right, so the top right is Jinx's Gatling gun called Pow Pow, and if you look at it, it has a very cylindrical design language, but if you look a little bit closer, there's some kind of more geometric designs. So like you have the square on the handle, and you have the kind of stylized uh, holes that the bullets come through, compared to Fishbones, where its design language is definitely pointed more at the pointy, triangular, cylindrical feel, compared to Pow Pow. Um, you get the sense that it's very pointy, which reads as dangerous, and pretty much the design language sets it apart from her other gun, um, and also kind of hints at her use of it in the final chapters of Arcane. If you look at a comparison of these two, it's really hard to see because I can't zoom in on these. But if you look at the props on the left, a lot of them have bigger kind of splotches of texture. Like if you look at this, and these big swaths of kind of uh, color changes compared to these, where it's a little bit more subtle. So even though these artists are all kind of working on the same IP, they still bring something a little bit different to the table, just to kind of set things apart a little bit. So like if you look at these, there's always a warm light on the left side and then a cool light on the right side compared to the person who pretty much worked on Jinx's stuff. Um, so these little design languages and differences are important. Like it's important to kind of, yes, work in that IP style, but also kind of figure out ways you can implement your own voice into the stuff you're working on. Uh, looking at the characters, as we can see, they're more stylized clothing folds. Their appearance, or they have kind of a more focus on shape language in the characters. So like Vi has this kind of like square language. Jinx has more of a diagonal shape language. And then if you also look at Silco, he kind of has very distinct planes on his face, which is something that's used a lot in Arcane, and is I think what set it apart from a lot of other animations, because they did figure out how to kind of break down their light and shadow into coherent shapes that are actually pretty stylized. And as a result, you kind of get this really geometric lighting, like in Valorant, but it's more with League style characters. Um, if you look at Silco, he also has kind of like a smoothness. So like you can see it's not a super harsh plane change, but there's still enough of like an implied line to get the sense of, oh hey, his face is very planar, which is something very different from both Valorant and League. He also has similar distressing on his like pants and his vest, which kind of calls back again to that Valorant and League combo style. And it's just a design language that's shown throughout the entire show. Like if you look at Heimer, he has a hell a lot of hair, so he has more shapes going on, but as you can see, they're still kind of broken down into these general blocky shapes of rendering. Uh, oh, 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 oops. So moving on to our other case study, we're gonna look at The Last of Us. This has a more realistic style, so kind of going back to the what does realism bring to the table. This serves the story better than a more stylized game would, and it helps the audience resonate with it a little bit more because it does have a lot of kind of cinematic scenes. Uh, because it's a story about, Joel, I think his name is, and Ellie traveling throughout an apocalyptic zombie world, pretty much. Again, the theming kind of drives it into a more mature zone because they're dealing with, not only body horror zombies, but they're also learning to handle loss, grief, death, and just kind of surviving in this really kind of hostile environment that this post-apocalyptic city is. So pretty much by keeping it realistic, they're able to kind of add in these kind of CG scenes that kind of add a little bit of an extra oomph to it. And it allows characters to kind of shine because, CGs are set, so you can have characters do specific things that you may not be able to do in, say, a not CG format. Of course, not all adults will enjoy it, but it's pointed towards adults, and it's kind of like up to the viewer. My brain is not working. Apologies. So it's important to like make these decisions and figuring out what would best work for your story and how you want to tell your story. In this case, they want a realistic story and they're doing CGs and they're kind of letting their characters roam around in this very rich world that's between gameplay and kind of a more cinematic sense. This is definitely not for kids. If you showed a kid this, they would probably be scarred. Like the last time that I watched something that was not in my age range, I was horribly terrified and couldn't sleep for like a month. So definitely make sure like you're understanding what audience you're pointing towards because a kid is going to be absolutely horrified of these. Like they're not going to understand it's not real, and they're just going to be freaked out. Cause hey, body horror and kids are not a super great mix. So kind of moving into kind of the ways they stylize their characters, if you look at each individual character, you can kind of get a read for a little bit about who that character is and perhaps, the purpose they serve in the story. This is specifically towards The Last of Us 2. So, you know, these small details are introduced into the characters, which help kind of form an additional read beyond just, looking at that character. Uh, so, if you look at it, um, or sorry, hold on. As the story progresses, our main character Ellie, who's this top lady, if for anyone who doesn't know The Last of Us, you can actually see her ideological shifts throughout the second game by just looking at her clothing choice. I'm not going to go into detail of it because it is spoilers, so make of that what you will. And as you can see, these kind of concept arts are a little bit all over the place, but they kind of bring all these separate art visions together via the models and kind of the more post-production area. Um, you also kind of still get the sense that the characters fit together, even though their concept arts are all very different from each other. Um, and then as a result, you can kind of read a little bit into the characters based on the differences of their clothing choices. There is realistic folds, these are very real looking people, and that's just the choice they made when they were setting up the story and kind of where they wanted the art direction to go. Um, if you look at the small details, so for example, Ellie versus Dina, you get the sense that Ellie perhaps may not be super comfortable with herself. She's always kind of wearing these really big jackets, which is a hint to her actual relationship with her, I want to say, father figure, Joel. And then if you look at Dina, she has a lot more kind of a sort of triangular design language. So Ellie has these kind of more square pockets, whereas Dina has, these more triangular shapes that are in hers. And, she doesn't reveal a super lot of skin, but it's definitely more skin than Ellie is showing, which kind of gives a sense that, she's a little bit more comfortable with who she is as a person. And then if you look at kind of the way they set up Abby, this is the antagonist of the second game. I mean, she's definitely a lot older than Ellie and Dina. You kind of get the sense that Ellie and Dina are around the same age, whereas Abby literally towers over both of them, from what I recall. Um, you see that she doesn't really have a lot of fluff to her character, and that's because she's a very kind of resourceful person who doesn't really carry anything that she's not going to use. She's all business, no play. And if you look, you also kind of get that read by the fact that she's not looking at you straight on. So kind of these little differences all kind of feed into that style and aesthetic that The Last of Us chose to specifically tell their story for their characters in their world. And then moving on to kind of a more stylized example, if you look at Cult of the Lamb, it you may say it's a cute game, but it's not about cute things, because for anyone who doesn't know, these are the old gods. They are trying to stop you from freeing another god that gives you the powers you have. And you kind of get a sense of their aesthetic just even by looking at this. You know, it's very vibrant colors. There's a lot of you know, cult like symbology, like with the pentagram and candles and, sacrificial weird skeletons and stuff like that. And if you also look, they go specifically with a kind of just straight through line work for each of their characters. Um, if you look, also the skeletons are stylized. They look to be about the same size as the main character, which every character that is a follower and not, a super powerful being that you're trying to take down, they're generally all about the same size. So again, that's kind of a decision that Massive Monster made to tell their story. They said, hey, we want these characters and these old gods to be a completely different read than the friendly little guys that you kind of have running around your village. And so that's kind of part of their aesthetic is the size differences between various characters. Also, it's important to realize, hey, these skeletons, like, they're pretty, anatomically correct. You understand, like, hey, that was, like, a character that we may have seen. But they're not super realistic because that would break the character or break the player's immersion if you just walk into a room and all of a sudden there's like this 100% anatomically realistic skeleton. Unless, again, that's the precedent you set. But kind of looking at the characters more, uh, you know, they look like animals. Surprise, surprise. They are definitely more shape-based compared to, say, The Last of Us and Arcane, because, I mean, look how few shapes there are. He's literally a rectangle with a fox, like, simplified shape fox head. And it's also a little bit cartoonish because this is like, if they're angry with you, they start dissenting. And I mean, no one's eyes get red when they're angry, unless I guess you pop blood vessels. But again, it's kind of that cartoony style, especially with, more NPC characters like, I forget this one's name, but this is the fish guy. And you kind of get a sense that, they're sillier characters because they don't really follow real life anatomy, but they still fit in with these other characters that you run around and see in the world. And also, they are not anatomically correct, which is just a precedent they set up, you know, when setting their aesthetic for the game. And they like to meme about how the bird does not fit, realistic bird faces. Um, so kind of taking a look at environments, since we haven't really looked at environments, these are the four main combat zones in the game, and you can see each of them has a pretty simple design language. Like the grass is pretty much the same throughout, and there's these scary imageries, and there's a black or a very dark background around the arena you walk through, but they each have something that kind of sets them apart from each other. And again, this is not a kids game because if you threw a kid into this game, they'd probably be freaked out because I mean, in this zone, there's literally people fused to mushrooms and they move around and there's always kind of a sense that you're being watched, which is also kind of a reference back to the idea that you're fighting old gods. Um, so again, the themes of this game push it kind of out of that more, colorful, cute for kids genre into a more adult genre because you're literally building a cult, you're sacrificing people, and you're killing gods that have a lot of blood, and they also explode. So hey, that's not for kids. Don't show kids that because you're gonna freak them out. Um, so kind of tying this all back together. So why is learning how to kind of break down styles and then work in those styles important? So the main two reasons is concept art. It's important to be able to flex your style because a lot of companies have different IPs that work in very different styles. For example, if you look at Overwatch from Blizzard, it's a very different style compared to, the very big chunky design language of World of Warcraft, and it's very different from the design languages of the demons from like the Diablo series. Uh, so it's a big range of kind of what you can work in a studio. And if you're able to show that you're able to work in multiple different styles, it increases your chances that, hey, you're going to be put on multiple different projects. Um, it's also important for VizDev artists in the animation realm because, you have uh, like Disney, for example. I'm going to include Pixar under the Disney title because they are owned by Disney. So if you think about it, one of their newer movies, Lightyear, is very realistic. I mean, Buzz Lightyear is a stylized human, but the environments and everything are very realistic compared to, say, Hotel Transylvania, where a lot of things are more stylized and their characters are mostly shape based. Um, and then that's compared to like DreamWorks or Sony, who are kind of like, for example, Sony has Spider-Man, I think. He's a super realistic guy, but he can also like, or sorry, they also have like Mitchell's versus the Machines. For anyone familiar, it's kind of like I want to say Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, where the humans are very stylized. Um, Hotel Transylvania again. It's very stylized figures, but that's also a very different design language compared to Mitchell's versus the Machines. And of course, the Spider-Verse movie they released, where, you know, bright colors and kind of like 2D effects were a big part of that IP. The other thing is, it's also very important because, hey, in a, team of artists, if you're working on a game or an animation, you're going to have a lot of people with different styles working in a coherent style because you can't have, you know, again, unless the precedent is set, usually a specific aesthetic is chosen and then everyone kind of works in that aesthetic. But it's also important to remember that you should introduce a little bit of like your own flair to something. Because brain not working. um, Yeah, so you want to speak in the same language as all the other artists, but it's also important to kind of set yourself apart from those other artists via, small things. Like again, like Arcane. One artist had bigger splotches of kind of color variations or weathering on their objects compared to Jinx's stuff, which was a little bit cleaner. Still kind of had the same similar design language where it had that, kind of color change, but it wasn't anywhere near as obvious as on the other ones. Um, so kind of just throwing this out here. If anyone would like to challenge exercise, flex your arm muscles, maybe get a little bit out of your zone, choose an IP from this presentation and try and design something that would fit or work in that world with the characters or props or environments. So this is the point where I will set you all free, and if you'd like to do the exercise, then I'll throw it in chat.